The light cut through the fog, a steady, pulsing heartbeat against the gray canvas of the sea. Below, on the water, a small flotilla of boats bobbed gently, their occupants gazing up at the old lighthouse, now reborn. It was a beacon not just for ships, but for people. For Helen, watching from the lantern room, it was vindication. It was home. The iron catwalk beneath her feet was solid, the glass around her spotless, and the beam she and Frank had rigged swept across the water with a reliability that shamed its 100-year-old predecessor. It was a sight that had become a local phenomenon, a quiet testament to what could be built from ruin. But to understand how a 78-year-old woman and her husband, cast out by their own son, turned $9 worth of rusted iron into a landmark, I need to take you back to the beginning. Back to the day the world fell away. It began, as most tragedies do, with a lie wrapped in the language of love. Their son, David, had visited them in the small house Frank had built with his own 2 hands 53 years ago. He sat at the familiar kitchen table, the one with the slight wobble Frank always meant to fix, and spoke of estate planning and probate taxes. His words were smooth, practiced. He spoke of protecting them, of ensuring their legacy was secure. "It's just a formality, Mom," he had said, his hand covering hers. His hands were soft, unlike his father's, which were a roadmap of hard work. "We signed the house over to me now, and it saves a world of trouble later. Nothing changes. This will always be your home. I promise." Helen, a retired librarian who had spent her life understanding the fine print, felt a flicker of unease. But she looked at Frank, his face open and trusting, and she looked at her only son, a man in a tailored suit who seemed so capable, so concerned. She pushed the feeling down. Doubt felt like a betrayal. They had raised him to be smart, to be successful. This was just him taking care of them, the way they had always taken care of him. So they signed. The papers were crisp. The notary's stamp was heavy and final. They signed away the roof over their heads, the floorboards that held their memories, the garden where they had grown roses and tomatoes for half a century. They signed it all away for a promise. 2 months later, the promise was broken. David arrived again, this time not with papers, but with an announcement. He wasn't alone. A man with a clipboard stood slightly behind him, avoiding their eyes. "There's been a change of plans," David started, the practiced smoothness gone, replaced by a brittle efficiency. "A fantastic opportunity came up. A development company made an offer on this whole block. An incredible offer." Frank stared at him, uncomprehending. "Offer? This is our house, David." "Technically, it's my house now, Dad," David said, and the words landed like stones. "And I've sold it. It's for the best. The upkeep is getting to be too much for you, and this deal secures my future. Our future." Helen felt the air leave her lungs. The room seemed to tilt. The flicker of unease she had ignored 2 months ago roared into a wildfire of cold, sickening certainty. She looked at her son and saw a stranger. "You promised," she whispered. The words were barely audible. "I know, Mom, and I've taken care of everything," he said, his voice imbued with a false brightness that was more insulting than any anger would have been. "I've found a perfect place for you. Oakwood Meadows. It's a top-of-the-line assisted living facility. You'll have your own room, meals, activities. No more worrying about leaky roofs or property taxes." He slid a glossy brochure across the wobbly kitchen table. Pictures of smiling, silver-haired seniors playing shuffleboard and eating ice cream stared up at them. It looked like a cheerful prison. Frank finally found his voice. It was low, dangerous. "Get out. Dad, be reasonable." "I said, get out of my house," Frank repeated, his knuckles white where he gripped the back of a chair. David's face hardened. The mask of the caring son fell away, revealing the cold calculus beneath. "It's not your house. The sale is final. The new owners take possession in 2 weeks. You can move to Oakwood, or you can find somewhere else. But you have to be out." He left a brochure on the table, a monument to his betrayal. The 2 weeks that followed were a blur of quiet horror. They moved like ghosts through the home that was no longer theirs. Every object held a memory, and every memory was now tainted. The notch on the doorframe marking David's height at age 6. The faded spot on the wallpaper where a framed finger painting had hung for 30 years. The scent of wood shavings that always lingered in Frank's workshop. They packed. They sorted a lifetime of possessions into 3 piles: keep, donate, trash. The keep pile was heartbreakingly small, limited to what would fit in the back of their 20-year-old pickup truck. Photographs, a few precious tools, clothes, Helen's most treasured books. The rest was left behind, artifacts for the bulldozers. They didn't speak of David. His name was a wound too raw to touch. They worked in a silence punctuated only by the scrape of cardboard boxes and the rustle of packing paper. The silence was heavy with shock, with grief, with a profound and disorienting shame. How could they have been so foolish? How could they have not seen the person their son had become? On the final day, they stood on the curb and watched as a moving truck, hired by David, arrived to take them to Oakwood Meadows for a trial stay. 2 young men, polite and detached, began loading their few boxes. Frank looked at Helen. Her face was pale, her shoulders slumped. He saw in her eyes the same crushing despair he felt in his own chest. He had built that house to protect her, to give her a safe harbor, and he had failed. He made a decision. It was not a plan. It was a refusal. He walked over to the driver of the moving truck. "Take the boxes out," he said, his voice firm. "Put them in our truck." The driver looked confused. "Sir, my work order says—" "I don't care what it says. That's our property. Put it in our truck." He walked back to Helen, took the keys to their pickup from her trembling hand, and helped her into the passenger seat. He didn't know where they were going. He only knew they were not going to Oakwood Meadows. They were not going to the place their son had chosen for them. They would not be discarded so easily. He drove away from the only home they had ever known, and he did not look back. The first night, they slept in the truck at a highway rest stop. The next morning, they found a motel. The Seafoam Inn. It sounded prettier than it was. The sign was missing the S, and the color was appealing, sun-bleached green that was more mold than foam. Their rooms smelled of stale cigarettes and disinfectant. A single window looked out onto the parking lot and a rumbling ice machine. This was their new reality. They were 78 and 79 years old, and they were homeless. The days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of waking up in the lumpy motel bed, eating cheap food from a nearby diner, and trying to figure out what to do next. Their savings were mostly gone, drained by David over the past year for investments they now understood they would never see again. They had their Social Security, enough for the motel and food, but not enough to rent an apartment, not with the deposits and credit checks required. Frank tried to find work. He went to construction sites, workshops, boatyards. He was strong for his age, his hands still capable. But no one wanted to hire a man nearing 80. They saw a liability, not a lifetime of experience. He came back to the motel each evening, his shoulders a little more stooped, the hope in his eyes a little dimmer. Helen tried to find a way forward through logic and order, the way she always had. She sat for hours at the small, sticky desk in the motel room with a notepad and pen, trying to budget their meager income. The numbers were relentless. They were bleeding money, slowly but unstoppably. She called legal aid, but their case was complicated, a civil matter, they were told. It would take months, years, and money they didn't have. They were invisible, a statistic, 2 more elderly people who had fallen through the cracks. The feeling of shame was the worst part. They avoided eye contact with the other motel residents. They spoke in low voices, as if to hide their presence. They had been proud, self-sufficient people. They had built a life, a family, a home, and now they had nothing. They had been erased. One night, Helen couldn't sleep. The hum of the ancient air conditioner was a grating, mechanical snore. Frank was asleep in the other bed, his breathing shallow and troubled. She felt a wave of despair, so profound it was almost physical, a weight pressing down on her chest. She had to do something, anything. She opened her laptop, a relic as old as their truck, and connected to the motel's painfully slow Wi-Fi. She didn't know what she was looking for. She just typed words into the search bar. Affordable housing, senior assistance, land for sale. The results were a grim parade of waiting lists, income requirements they didn't meet, and properties far beyond their reach. Hours passed. The screen glowed in the dark room, illuminating her tired face. Frustration gave way to a kind of desperate, morbid curiosity. She started exploring the forgotten corners of the internet, the digital equivalent of dusty attics. She found her way to a government surplus auction website. It was a graveyard of old office furniture, impounded vehicles, and obsolete equipment. She scrolled endlessly, listlessly, and then she saw it. The listing was buried deep within the site. Under maritime and coastal assets, the photo was grainy, low resolution, taken on an overcast day. It showed a cylinder of rusted metal rising from a cluster of dark rocks, surrounded by a churning, gray sea. The description was brief, clinical. Lot number 734. Decommissioned Cape Fear offshore lighthouse. Steel and iron construction on stone caisson base. Built 1898. Decommissioned 1964. Sold as is, where is access by boat only. Buyer responsible for all transport and associated costs. And then, the final line. Current bid, $100. Helen stared at the image. It was derelict, abandoned, forgotten, a monument to rust and neglect, left to be battered by the sea. It was, she thought with a grim sense of irony, a perfect reflection of how she felt. But it was also something else. It was a structure. It was solid. It was on a piece of land, or rock at least, that no one else wanted. An idea, wild and irrational, began to form in her mind. It wasn't a plan for survival. It was an act of defiance. It was a refusal to be erased. The auction was ending in 1 hour. There were 2 other bids, pushing the price to $7. Using the last of the money on a prepaid credit card, Helen typed in her bid. $9. She watched the countdown timer on the screen. 10 minutes. 5. 1. The screen refreshed. Auction closed. Winning bid, $900. For $9, she had bought a lighthouse. The next morning, she showed Frank. She opened the laptop on the stained bedspread and pointed to the grainy photo. He squinted at the screen, then looked at her as if she had grown a second head. "You did what?" "I bought it," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's ours." "Helen, for God's sake, it's a piece of junk in the middle of the ocean. What are we going to do with it? We don't have a boat. We don't have any money. We're living in this place." He gestured around the miserable room, his frustration and despair finally boiling over. "This is a joke." "No," she said, her gaze unwavering. "This room is a joke. Being told we're finished is a joke. David's promise was a joke. This," she tapped the screen, "is a foundation. It's made of stone and iron. It was built to withstand hurricanes. It's been abandoned for 50 years, and it's still standing, Frank. After all those storms, after all that neglect, it's still standing." He looked at her then, really looked at her. He saw the weariness in her face, the dark circles under her eyes. But he also saw something else, something he hadn't seen since the day David had shattered their world. He saw a spark, a flicker of the determined, brilliant woman he had married. The woman who had organized community book drives, who had balanced their finances to the penny, who had faced down a stubborn school board to get a new library wing built. The fight wasn't gone. It had just been dormant. He sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the picture of the rusted tower. It was insane. It was impossible. It was the only thing that made any sense at all. It was a problem that could be solved with his hands, not with lawyers or paperwork. It was a wall to be rebuilt, not a betrayal to be endured. A slow smile spread across his face, the first real smile in months. "All right, Helen," he said, the words feeling strange and wonderful in his mouth. "Let's go see our new home." Getting there was the first hurdle. They used the last of their emergency cash, the $200 Helen had kept taped inside a book, to hire a man with a small fishing boat. His name was Gus, and his boat smelled of diesel and bait. He looked them over, 2 old folks with a pile of cardboard boxes and a handful of tools, and shook his head. "You're the ones who bought the old light?" he asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "You know it's a wreck, right? Nothing out there but gulls and rust." "We know," Frank said, his jaw set. "Just take us out." The ride was choppy. The mainland shrank behind them, and for 45 minutes, There was nothing but the gray-green water and the sky. Then, it appeared on the horizon, a dark needle sticking out of the sea. As they got closer, the scale of its decay became apparent. It was worse than the photograph. The steel plates of the tower were streaked with decades of rust, bleeding orange tears down to the stone base. The lantern room at the top was a skeleton of iron, its glass long since shattered by storms. A cloud of seabirds swirled around it, their cries sharp and unwelcoming. Gus maneuvered the boat carefully alongside the stone caisson. A rusted iron ladder, slick with algae, led up to a small platform. "This is as close as I get," Gus said. "Ladder looks rotten. Be careful." Frank went first. He tested the ladder with his weight. It groaned in protest, but held. He climbed slowly, his movements sure and practiced. Helen watched, her heart in her throat. He reached the top and turned, giving her a thumbs up. Then it was her turn. The rungs were cold and slimy, but she focused on placing her hands and feet, one after another, until Frank's strong hand was there to pull her onto the platform. They stood there for a moment, catching their breath. The wind was relentless, whipping at their clothes and carrying the salty spray. Gus and his son started hauling up their boxes and tools with a rope. The entrance was a heavy iron door, its paint blistered and peeling. The lock was a solid mass of rust. Frank took a hammer and a pry bar from his tool bag. It took him 10 minutes of hard, jarring work, but finally, with a screech of tortured metal, the door swung inward. The smell that hit them was overwhelming. Damp, decay, and the acrid stench of 50 years of bird droppings. The inside was a circular, cavernous space. Water dripped from the ceiling, pooling on the floor. The spiral staircase that wound its way up the interior wall was skeletal. Patches of its grating rusted completely through. It was a tomb. Gus looked in, his face a mask of pity. "I'll come back for you in a week," he said. "No charge. Just be ready." He clearly expected them to be begging to return ashore. "We'll be fine," Frank said, not looking at him. He was looking up at the bones of the structure. Gus just shook his head and motored away, leaving them alone on their $9 island. Helen felt a tremor of fear, a voice in her head screaming, "What have you done?" This wasn't a home. It was a ruin. It was a cold, wet, dangerous place. Frank must have sensed her panic. He walked over to a wall, running his hand over the curved iron plates. He tapped it with the head of his hammer. The sound was a dull, solid thud. "Good bones," he murmured, more to himself than to her. They built things to last back then. He turned to her, his eyes clear and focused. The defeated man from the motel was gone. In his place was Frank the builder, the man who saw not what was, but what could be. "First thing," he said, "is a dry place to sleep. And fresh water." That was how it began. Not with grand plans, but with small, essential acts of survival. They found the Lighthouse's old cistern, and to their astonishment, it still held rainwater, stale but filterable. They had brought a small camping stove and a water filter, preparing for the worst. Frank immediately set to work on the roof of the lowest level, the old storage room. He used salvaged pieces of metal from a collapsed interior wall and a can of industrial sealant they had bought with their last few dollars. While he worked, Helen began the monumental task of cleaning. She swept out decades of filth, scraped bird nests from the walls, and scrubbed a small section of the floor until the original stone tiles were visible. By nightfall, they had one small, relatively clean, and mostly dry room. They laid out their sleeping bags on the cold floor. They ate canned soup heated on the camp stove. The only light came from a battery-powered lantern. The wind howled outside, a lonely, mournful sound. The waves crashed against the stone base, a constant, rhythmic drumming. Helen lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the sea and the storm. She was exhausted, her muscles ached, and she was terrified. But as she listened to Frank's steady breathing beside her, she realized something else. For the first time in months, she did not feel helpless. She did not feel invisible. They were not waiting for someone to save them or discard them. They were acting. They were building. It was a start. The first week was brutal. Their bodies, unaccustomed to such hard physical labor, screamed in protest. Every muscle ached. Their hands were raw with blisters. They were constantly cold and damp. But every day, they made progress. Frank, with an almost feral ingenuity, became a master of salvage. He saw potential in every piece of rusted junk. A corroded sheet of copper became a patch for the cistern. The heavy oak from a rotted-out desk was repurposed into a workbench. He climbed the treacherous spiral staircase, testing each step, and began the slow, painstaking process of reinforcing it with wire and scavenged bolts. Helen, meanwhile, imposed order on the chaos. She was the strategist, the quartermaster. She cataloged their meager supplies, rationing their food and fresh water with meticulous care. She explored every inch of the lighthouse, creating detailed diagrams in a notebook, marking areas of critical damage, potential living spaces, and salvageable materials. Her list became their blueprint for survival. They worked from sunrise to sunset, falling into an exhausted sleep each night. They spoke little, their energy consumed by the tasks at hand. But a new kind of communication grew between them, a shorthand of shared glances and understood gestures. A nod from Frank meant a tool was needed. A pointed finger from Helen indicated the next area to be cleaned. They were a team, honed by 53 years of marriage, now operating with a singular, desperate purpose. When Gus returned after a week, he was visibly shocked. He had expected to find two broken, defeated old people ready to give up. Instead, he found a clean, organized workspace on the first floor. He saw the patched roof, the reinforced ladder, the small stack of neatly sorted scrap metal. Frank handed him a list Helen had prepared. It was for supplies: nails, sealant, lumber, rope, working goods. Gus looked from the list to their determined faces. The pity in his eyes was replaced by a grudging respect. "You two are serious," he said, stating the obvious. "We're home," Helen replied simply. They had no money to pay him. Frank offered him his wedding ring, a simple gold band worn thin with time. Gus pushed his hand away. "Keep it," he said gruffly. "Your credit's good with me." For now, he didn't smile, but it was a victory. He was their first ally, though he didn't know it yet. Their next trip to the mainland was a necessity. They were out of everything. Gus dropped them at the town dock, promising to return in a few hours. The small coastal town of Port Blossom was a world away from the isolated reality of the lighthouse. People bustled along the sidewalks. Cars drove past. The world hummed with a life they had forgotten. They walked to the hardware store, a place called Silas's Supply. It was an old-fashioned store, the kind that smelled of sawdust and fertilizer, with narrow aisles packed to the ceiling. Behind the counter stood a man who looked as weathered as the building itself. He was tall and thin, with a face like a topographical map and eyes that missed nothing. This was Silas. He looked at their list, then at them. His gaze lingered on their worn clothes and calloused hands. "Big project?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. "You could say that," Frank said. "You're the Lighthouse people," Silas stated. It wasn't a question. News traveled fast in a town this size. "Heard you were crazy." "Don't look crazy. Look tired." They gathered their supplies, the bill growing to a sum that made Helen's stomach clench. It was more money than they had to their name. When the total was rung up, Frank looked Silas in the eye. "We need to start a line of credit," he said. Silas leaned on the counter, studying them for a long moment. "I don't give credit to folks I don't know, especially not folks living in a condemned rust bucket." Helen stepped forward. She placed her notebook on the counter, opened to the page with her detailed inventory and work plan. She had diagrams of Frank's repairs, a projected timeline, and a budget for the next 3 months. It was a librarian's battle plan. "We are not squatters, Mr. Silas," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We are restoring a historic property. My husband is a master carpenter. We are meticulous, and we pay our debts." Silas picked up the notebook. He flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. He saw the precise handwriting, the carefully drawn lines, the sheer, exhaustive detail. He looked at Helen's steady gaze and Frank's proud, weary posture. He saw people who had been knocked down but were not knocked out. He saw integrity. He closed the notebook and pushed it back toward her. "All right," he said. $100 limit. For now. Pay me when you can. And the name's just Silas." It was their second victory. A small act of trust from a stranger, but it felt monumental. It was a lifeline. With access to proper materials, the pace of their work quickened. Frank, armed with new lumber and fasteners, built them a proper room on the second level, which had been the lighthouse keeper's main living quarters. He framed walls, patched the floor, and installed a small, efficient wood-burning stove, its pipe venting out a broken window he had repaired. For the first time, they were warm and dry. Helen turned this new space into a home. She unpacked their few boxes. She placed a framed photo of them as a young couple on a makeshift shelf. She arranged her books near the small window that now held a sturdy piece of plexiglass. It was a sparse, rugged existence, but it was theirs. A routine formed. Mornings were for heavy construction. Afternoons were for cleaning, organizing, and planning. Evenings were for rest, for reading by the light of the stove, for watching the sun set over the endless expanse of water. They were rediscovering not only their purpose, but each other. The trauma of their eviction had isolated them in their shared grief. Now, the shared work was reconnecting them. They talked more, laughed occasionally. The lighthouse was healing them. The story of the lighthouse people grew in Port Blossom. Gus, their reluctant ferryman, became their unofficial spokesman, sharing tales of their progress with anyone who would listen. Silas, at the hardware store, would confirm the stories, adding details about the quality of materials Frank was ordering. One day, a young woman appeared at the dock as they were loading supplies. She looked no older than 20, with a haunted look in her eyes and a belly that was swollen with pregnancy. She introduced herself as Maya. "Are you the people from the lighthouse?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Helen nodded. "I read about you," she said, clutching a worn copy of the local newspaper, which had run a small, quirky article about their project. "It said you were building a home from nothing. It said you were safe." The story came out in hesitant pieces. She was running from an abusive boyfriend, the father of her child. She had nowhere to go, no family to turn to. She had a little money saved, but not enough for a place of her own. She was looking for a sanctuary. Helen and Frank exchanged a look. Their small, two-person world was about to be breached. They had so little to offer. A room in a cold, metal tower. A rugged, uncomfortable life. But they also remembered the feeling of being discarded, of having nowhere to turn. "There's room," Helen said, making the decision for both of them. "But you'll have to work." Maya's arrival changed the dynamic of the lighthouse. Her youthful energy, though shadowed by her past, was a welcome addition. She was a surprisingly hard worker, taking on the cleaning and cooking chores, freeing Helen to focus on planning and Frank to focus on construction. In the evenings, Helen would read to her, and Frank would tell her stories about the constellations he could now see so clearly in the night sky, far from the light pollution of the land. They were improbably a family. The article in the local paper had another, unexpected effect. Donations began to appear at Silas's store. An old but functional generator, cans of marine-grade paint, a set of solar panels from a retired sailor who admired their grit. The people of Port Blossom, initially skeptical, were starting to adopt their cause. It was a David and Goliath story they could root for. A month after Maya arrived, another soul found their way to them. An elderly man named Arthur, a retired fisherman who had been evicted from his rented room when the owner sold the building. He was proud and gruff, but his eyes held the same lost look they recognized so well. He knew his way around engines and mechanics. He got the donated generator running in a single afternoon. Suddenly, they had electricity. They had light. The lighthouse was no longer just a shelter. It was becoming a community, a small, floating sanctuary for the discarded. Frank taught Arthur and Maya basic carpentry. Arthur taught them how to fish from the caisson base, supplementing their diet with fresh food. Helen organized work schedules and managed the growing inventory of donated supplies. Maya, her belly growing larger each week, brought a sense of future and hope to the rusted tower. They were building more than just a home. They were building a new ecosystem, a self-sustaining world on their rock in the sea. The progress was astounding. The exterior of the lighthouse was scraped and painted a brilliant white with a bold red stripe. The interior rooms were clean, insulated, and livable. Frank, using the donated solar panels and Arthur's expertise, even managed to get a small, powerful LED beacon working in the lantern room. It wasn't an official navigational aid, but it was a symbol, a declaration. We are here. But their growing visibility came at a price. Their beacon, visible from the shore, attracted attention not just from well-wishers, but from the unblinking eye of bureaucracy. One blustery afternoon, a sleek boat with official-looking lettering on its side cut through the waves towards them. Two men in county uniforms disembarked, their faces grim and impassive. They carried clipboards and an air of unimpeachable authority. One of them, the clear superior, tacked a notice to the newly painted iron door. The paper flapped violently in the wind. "This is a condemnation notice," he announced, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "This structure is not zoned for residential use. It has failed to meet county building codes for habitation. You have 30 days to vacate the premises, after which the county will proceed with demolition." Helen felt the cold dread she remembered from the day David had betrayed them. The system had found them. The impersonal, implacable force that had no room for context or compassion. Frank stepped forward. "We've been restoring it," he said, his voice tight. "It's safer now than it's been in 50 years. The inspector gave a dismissive glance at Frank's handiwork. "That's unpermitted work. It doesn't matter. The zoning is inviolate." 30 days. They got back in their boat and left, leaving the white notice on the door like a death sentence. The small community stood on the platform, the wind whipping around them, the silence heavier than any storm. They had built a world, and now a piece of paper threatened to unmake it all. The news of the condemnation order hit Port Blossom like a shockwave. Silas was the first to act. He taped the notice to the front window of his hardware store with the words "Shame" written above it in thick black marker. He started a petition, and within a day, it had hundreds of signatures. Gus, their ferryman, organized a boat-in, a small flotilla of fishing boats and pleasure crafts that circled the lighthouse in a show of solidarity. The young journalist who had written the first article wrote a blistering follow-up piece for the paper, painting the county as heartless bullies and the lighthouse residents as folk heroes. The story was picked up by a regional television station. A news helicopter buzzed over the lighthouse, filming the brilliant white tower and the small group of people waving from a catwalk. The story of the old couple who bought a lighthouse for $9 and built a sanctuary for the forgotten was suddenly everywhere. Far away, in a city office, a young woman watched the evening news and recognized the determined face of her great-aunt Helen. Her name was Sarah, Helen's grandniece. She was an assistant district attorney, a sharp, tenacious lawyer who had inherited her great-aunt's intolerance for injustice. She hadn't seen Helen and Frank in years, but she remembered them fondly from childhood visits. She picked up the phone. The call was a lifeline. Sarah couldn't officially represent them. It was a conflict of interest, but she could advise them. She spent hours on the phone with Helen, poring over the county codes, the zoning laws, the historical preservation statutes. "There's a loophole," Sarah explained one night, her voice crackling over the satellite phone they now had. "The lighthouse is old enough to be considered for historic landmark status. If you can prove you're performing a legitimate historical restoration, not just building a residence, you can apply for a zoning variance. It's a long shot, but it's a shot." The news galvanized them. They had a path, a narrow and difficult one, but a path nonetheless. Helen, guided by Sarah, began the monumental task of assembling the application. It required architectural drawings, historical documentation, and a detailed log of all the restoration work performed. Her meticulous notebooks became their most powerful weapon. Frank, Arthur, and Maya redoubled their efforts, working with a feverish intensity. Every repair had to be perfect, every detail historically accurate. They weren't just fixing a building anymore. They were building a legal case. The public pressure on the county was immense. Letters poured in. The story went national. But the bureaucracy was a slow-moving beast, and the 30-day clock was still ticking. It was in the midst of this storm that another boat arrived unannounced. A sleek, expensive powerboat that looked glaringly out of place in the rugged waters. A lone figure stood at the bow. It was David. He looked different. The tailored suit was gone, replaced by expensive casual wear, but he looked haggard, his face tight with anger and stress. He had seen the news. His unreasonable parents had become a national sensation, a symbol of resilience. And he, by extension, had become the villain of the story. He stormed onto the platform, his eyes sweeping over the transformed lighthouse and the small group of people standing with his parents. He saw Maya, her pregnancy now obvious, and Arthur, his face set in a stony glare. "What is all this?" David demanded, his voice shaking with fury. "What are you trying to do? Are you trying to ruin me?" "We're trying to live," Frank said, his voice dangerously calm. "By making a spectacle? By making me look like a monster on television? My business partners are asking questions. My friends are shunning me. You're embarrassing me." Helen stepped forward. She looked at her son, at the man he had become, and she felt not anger, but a profound and weary pity. He couldn't see what they had built. He could only see how it reflected on him. "You were embarrassed by us long before this, David," she said, her voice clear and steady over the wind. "You were embarrassed by your father's calloused hands and my old-fashioned ideas. You were embarrassed by the small house you grew up in. You erased us from your life because we didn't fit into the world you wanted to build." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "We're not trying to prove anything to you. We're proving we exist. You seem to have forgotten." David stared at her, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. He looked for an ally, for someone to take his side, but he found only the cold, judging eyes of the strangers his parents had taken in. He was the outsider here. Frank, who had been standing silently beside Helen, simply turned his back on his son. He picked up a paintbrush and went back to work on a section of railing. The message clear. "You're not worth my time. You're not worth my anger. You're nothing." The gesture broke something in David. With a cry of frustration, he turned, scrambled back onto his expensive boat, and sped away, leaving only the churning wake behind him. No one watched him go. The final week before the deadline was a frantic race against time. The application for the variance, a document hundreds of pages long, was filed by Sarah's office. The county, besieged by public opinion and a looming legal fight they didn't want, agreed to a formal inspection. It was their one chance. If they passed, the condemnation would be stayed and the variance considered. If they failed, it was over. The day of the inspection dawned gray and overcast, the sea matching the sky. The same boat with the county officials arrived, the same grim-faced inspector in the lead. This time, they were accompanied by a woman Helen recognized from Sarah's research as the head of the county's historical commission, an architectural historian named Dr. Albright. Helen, Frank, Arthur, and Maya met them on the platform. They were nervous, but resolute. They had done the work. Now it was time for judgment. The lead inspector, clipboard in hand, began his tour with an air of profound skepticism. He was expecting a ramshackle, dangerous squat. He was prepared to find fault, to shut them down. But what he found was meticulous craftsmanship. He tapped on walls that Frank had reinforced with steel. He examined the new, safety-compliant wiring Arthur had installed for the solar panels. He ran his hand over the seamlessly patched ironwork on the spiral staircase. Every repair was solid, clean, and professional. He was silent, his expression unreadable, but Helen could see the surprise in his eyes. He was a man who understood construction, and he was looking at the work of a master. It was Dr. Albright, however, who seemed most impressed. She had brought the original blueprints for the lighthouse, and she compared them to the work that had been done. "This is extraordinary," she murmured, looking at the restored lantern mechanism. "You've used modern materials, the solar panels and LED, but you've preserved the original housing and gearing. It's a perfect blend of preservation and adaptation." She walked through the living quarters, noting the way Frank had framed the new walls inside the original iron shell, protecting the integrity of the structure. She looked at Helen's notebooks, which documented every step of the process with photographs and detailed notes. "This isn't just a repair job," Dr. Albright said, turning to the lead inspector. "This is a legitimate museum-quality restoration. The documentation alone is more thorough than most professional firms would provide." The inspector stood in the center of the main room, looking from the solid floor to the dry ceiling. He looked at the small, thriving community that stood before him. He looked at the pride and defiance in Frank's eyes and the quiet, unshakable dignity in Helen's. He finally closed his clipboard with a decisive snap. "Mister," he said, looking at Frank, the skepticism in his voice finally gone, replaced by something that sounded like awe. "This isn't a derelict property anymore. This is a residence. And frankly, it's built better than half the new condos on the mainland." He turned to Helen. "The condemnation order is withdrawn. I'll be recommending to the board that your application for a zoning variance be approved. And I'll be supporting Dr. Albright's proposal to have this site declared a county historic landmark." Vindication. It was a quiet, profound moment. There were no cheers, just a collective, relieved sigh. Tears streamed down Maya's face. Arthur clapped Frank on the shoulder, and Helen reached out and took her husband's hand, his rough, capable hand that had built their world twice over. The news of their victory was the final chapter in the story the media had fallen in love with. The lighthouse became a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of resilience against neglect, both personal and institutional. Donations, which had trickled in before, now became a flood. An online fundraising campaign, started by the journalists from the local paper, raised enough money to pay off Silas in full, establish a trust for the lighthouse's perpetual maintenance, and even provide a small stipend for its residents. The consequences for David were swift and severe. The national spotlight on his parents' story was a harsh glare on his own life. The story of how he had cheated them out of their home became public knowledge. His business partners, fearing the toxic publicity, pulled out of the condo development deal, leaving him in financial ruin. The empire he had been so desperate to build crumbled into dust, a casualty of his own greed. Justice, it turned out, didn't always come from a courtroom. Sometimes it came from the quiet, relentless turning of the tide. Life at the lighthouse settled into a new normal, a peaceful, purposeful rhythm. The seasons turned. The harsh winds of winter gave way to the gentle breezes of spring. Maya gave birth to a healthy baby girl, Luna, whose first cries echoed in the iron tower, a sound of new life in a place reborn. Arthur, the quiet mechanic, became the baby's doting grandfather figure, crafting her a beautiful cradle from salvaged driftwood. Frank built a small greenhouse on the platform, and Helen and Maya cultivated a thriving garden of herbs and vegetables in containers, a splash of vibrant green against the blue of the sea and the white of the tower. The lighthouse itself became a beloved local landmark. On sunny weekends, a small fleet of tourist boats would motor out, keeping a respectful distance, their passengers waving and taking pictures. Helen and Frank would wave back, two unlikely guardians of a forgotten piece of history they had saved from oblivion. They never charged a fee, never sought to monetize their new life. The lighthouse was a home, a sanctuary, not a tourist attraction. One afternoon, a letter arrived with the supply delivery from Gus. The handwriting was David's. Helen took it to the lantern room to read it alone. It was a long, rambling letter, full of self-pity and excuses, but buried within it were the words she had once thought she'd never see. "I'm sorry." She read the letter twice, then folded it and put it away in a small wooden box where she kept her most important papers. Forgiveness was a complex thing. It wasn't a switch to be flipped. The wound was too deep, the betrayal too fundamental. The door to her heart wasn't locked, but it wasn't wide open either. It was ajar, and that for now was enough. The community grew in its own quiet way. They never sought new members, but sometimes people found them. A young man struggling with addiction, sent by a sympathetic doctor in Port Blossom who thought the hard work, and isolation might heal him. A widow who had lost her home and her purpose, who found both in tending the garden and caring for baby Luna. The lighthouse became a beacon in the truest sense of the word, drawing in those who were lost in the storms of life. Each person contributed. Each person worked. It was a simple, unspoken contract. You were welcome here. You were safe here, as long as you helped to maintain the sanctuary for everyone. Years passed. The white paint on the tower was touched up each spring. The garden expanded. Baby Luna grew into a little girl who knew the names of the seabirds and considered the entire lighthouse her personal playground. Her laughter was the new music of the tower. One evening, Helen and Frank sat together on a bench Frank had built on the catwalk outside the lantern room. They were older now, their movements slower, their faces a deeper tapestry of wrinkles. But their eyes were bright, and their hands, as always, were intertwined. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The sea was calm, a vast sheet of deepening blue. The small, solar-powered light above them began to pulse, its steady beam cutting a silent, hopeful path across the water. They watched as a flock of pelicans flew past in perfect formation, their wings silhouetted against the dying light. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with a shared history of sorrow and triumph. Frank squeezed her hand. "Good work, Helen," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was the highest praise he knew how to give. She leaned her head on his shoulder, the familiar feel of his worn work sure to comfort she had cherished for more than half a century. They had lost a house, but they had built a world. They had been cast out by their own blood, but they had forged a new family from the broken pieces of other people's lives. They had been left to rust, but they had chosen to shine. She looked out at the horizon, at the endless meeting of sea and sky. She thought of the journey that had brought them to this impossible, wonderful place. The pain of the betrayal had not vanished, but it no longer defined them. It was just the beginning of the story, the dark soil from which something beautiful and unexpected had grown. The tide had turned.